you almost could call it a fusion with Israel. There's been a melding of identities, not exactly a melding, but it's just sort of like, as John Mearsheimer often describes, we're joined at the hips. We kind of become Siamese twins. And so it's just not going to be easy to separate. I mean, it's not just like, okay, yeah, this isn't working out. Because again, we have so many true believers, both in the government and, among the common people, that this will be very difficult. So it is a very dangerous situation because Israel has become increasingly kind of an apocalyptic cult, or it's a country that is now governed by an apocalyptic cult. And yeah, we have thrown in our lot with them. Now, like in the case of Iran, we'll have to see what happens. Again, Trump has shown some realism. I think, again, he's not the first one. Is other administrations. Biden, I think, came very close to war with Iran. George W. Bush did. But when they got close, again, I think there are enough people, again, the people that really understand the balance of military power just told them that this is a very, very bad idea, and they've pulled back. And it looks like Trump is yet another president who's done the same. But it's not over. Again, I think this will be key. If Trump is able to withstand the pressures, which are, are intense and probably will only become more intense over time as if he continues to pursue negotiations, then this is not that we have actually divorced Israel, but we have we'll show that we can achieve a degree of independence. Just a degree, just a step back from the abyss, and then maybe maybe not certainly not an actual divorce from Israel, but a slight distancing of the relationship. If we could achieve that, we'll see. I think it's all very, very unclear at this point. It's very doubtful. I mean, again, all of us were quite pleased by the ceasefire that was achieved, through the offices of Witkoff and who was working as Trump's envoy. But then they broke it. I mean, it fell apart, and it fell apart with our blessing and just a couple of months later. So we seem to be off to a good start with Iran, but we've seen good starts end very, very badly already. There is this lack of consistency, again, and I think in the case of the Middle East in general, it's not just a lack of consistency. There is a real question about whether or not, there really is goodwill. In the end, do they really want peace? I'm not sure that they really do. Maybe if they can get it cheaply, they'll go for it, but they may not make the sacrifices, or they may not persist, which is, again, to hammer out these agreements, it takes time. It takes, persistence. It takes patience. And I don't know if those are qualities that you really would associate with Trump. And maybe that he'll get frustrated with the Iranians at some point and do a 180. Or just tear it all up.
Right. Yeah. And if any deal that maybe is met between America and Iran, I'm sure that it won't satisfy Netanyahu. Netanyahu would only be satisfied with, right. So what could Israel do? What could Netanyahu do other than we talked about actually trying to attack on its own, and then that then help that they drag the United States in after Israel's attack? Is there anything like what kind of powers and pressures do they have to?
Well, again, they have a lot of. I mean, again, these mega donors, but more than that, there are really, let's say, passionate Israel supporters just throughout the administration, but also the permanent bureaucracy. So he has a lot of leverage to push, and he has AIPAC, and he has the other lobbies within the U.S. He has his friends in the media. He has a lot of leverage that he can pull on.
So do you think that if we do get some agreement, there's a good chance we'll renege on it, just like we did the last JCPOA?
Well, yeah, I think there is. I mean, again, it was Obama actually, he just immediately failed to do his part of it. It wasn't just the fact that Trump tore it up, but Obama failed to lift the sanctions. That was part of the deal. And, the Iranians have to be aware of that. Again, they just might go in and do this and say, oh, these people are probably going to cheat, but we'll do this. That'll just keep them off our backs for a while, like I was saying. And,
What
meanwhile,
happens
we've
if they
got,
cheat? If they cheat, then what does that do? I mean, further loss of face internationally, right, for the
it
Americans. Like,
should, it should, that should
no,
be the
you can't make
result.
agreements with the Americans anymore.
Right.
They always cheat on it.
Yeah, I think in the past, I mean, again, that like most of the world kind of just wasn't really looking closely. And then if the Americans condemned Iran, and again, the Europeans were supposed to be guarantors of the JCPOA, and they failed completely. They did not do their part either. And the Iranians saw all this, but it was just at that time. It was just that the U.S. had all the power, including the soft power, and the Iranians had none. So you can just kind of do what you wanted to Iran, and there didn't seem to be any consequences. But again, the world has changed. Again, Iran has friends that it didn't have before, and the U.S. soft power has declined. So it will be more difficult. I mean, yeah, okay, if we walk away, within the U.S., within the U.S. echo chamber, and with our Western allies, probably they'll put the blame on Iran somehow, which is what they've always done in the past. But it's not going to. I don't think it's going to be convincing again for the rest of the world.
Yeah. And I feel like if you say that we're joined at the hip with Israel, then eventually we're going to be headed to some type of all-out war. Because I just don't see Israel looking into the future. I just don't see them stopping what they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank, and it's going to incite some type of pushback from their neighbors. They'll continue into Lebanon and Syria. Zionism, I feel like, is dying, and I just feel like the U.S. will be dying with it. That's kind of the scary part.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. I mean, there's a real chance of that. This again, I think it's going to end very badly for Israel, but the bad end for Israel will likely involve us. Again, we're far away, but it will be a humiliation. And maybe
It's so frustrating. It's so crazy. There's no reason for this. I don't understand how. I don't even want to ask you the question, because I always ask you, like, how did it get to this point where the
Yeah.
Israel lobby and the Zionists have so much control over my country that we can just make such irrational decisions that are not in the interest of the United States at all, that are destroying the United States, that is destroying the United States.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling to me. And we just got to sit and watch it happen and get called anti-Semites for it.
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, yeah, it's very frustrating. Again, like we've said before, there are trends that are encouraging. There is a real shift in public opinion, especially among younger people, both conservative and liberal. Both Republican leaning and Democrat leaning, and that bodes well for the future. And it's got to be very alarming for the Israel firsters. Their reign will come to an end. So there is a chance. Again, I think, like I've said, the I think what we can really hope for. I'm afraid it's going to come too late to save Gaza or the Palestinians, but we can hope for, with regard to the U.S. relationship to Israel, is that there will be eventually, that the Zionist influence will be driven from this government. It may take a whole another generation. Hopefully it won't be that long. Again, it seems like Israel's own actions is accelerating the trend. And maybe instead of being a generation, it could be 5 or 10 years or something. But we do see a real dramatic shift away from Israel and in favor of the Palestinians, that I think is just bound to have an impact on this country. And if we can change our policy, that would be the best thing of all. Maybe we're looking for a way to gracefully bow out. I think that's something we can hope for. It's not impossible, but it's going to be, the years ahead, the months ahead are a real minefield, because that that old power is still very much in control, and they're just not going to let go. It's until they're forced out. Through maybe a series of elections or something. That's the best that we could hope for. But it's just not going to happen right away. In the meantime, I think that as they sense that the end may be coming, that Zionism is in real danger, that they may become increasingly reckless. And I think that's what we're seeing already in Israel.
Right. What would happen to Israel if the United States wasn't there backing it up?
That would be the end. I mean, there's just no way that Israel could maintain all these, this hostile
It would
posture.
cease to exist as a state, or would they be forced to somehow normalize? Do you think there's a
Yeah,
chance that they could normalize?
there would be real, that's what they would be looking at. Um, if we really did, if we cut all, said not another bullet, you guys got to end this. You got to make peace. You got to have achieve the two-state solution. Well, there would be tremendous pressure, and that's the thing is like everybody in power in Israel now is just very much devoted to Zionism, to an expanding Israel. And you talk about the two-state solution. Of course, they're 800,000 settlers in the West Bank, and the plans are to reintroduce settlers into Gaza. It's clear, that's actually they're getting ready to do that. And it's just that, these people, okay, they're not all fanatics, but a lot of them are. And Israel has nuclear bombs. Who knows what they would do? Again, if the U.S. does cut that support, that may be the ultimate blackmail. Is that when it comes down to it, where we finally said, okay, we've had it with you guys, we're cutting support, and they say, well, we've got these bombs that we're going to set off if you do that. I'm just throwing that out there, but I don't think that's completely ridiculous. And just
do you think they have bombs hidden around the world?
I don't think so.
No?
I can't say that that's not possible. Of course, anything's possible. I haven't heard any such reports.
Yeah, I mean, it seems ridiculous, but that pager attack was also just
took everybody by surprise.
Took everybody by surprise, and I think that's got to be pretty damaging as well to Israel. It's like, like you said, you can't just rule by fear. And that's kind of their strategy. Is that who knows, we might blow you up, because like that's it's pretty pretty dark.
It is. But that again, that's the direction that Israel is moving in. I think before, like if you certainly went back to the years following the 1967 Six-Day War, the support for Israel's image, especially in the Western world, there was a lot of anger, in the Arab world and much of the Third World, about that war. But in the U.S. in particular, and much of the Western world, I think there was a real, widely felt admiration for Israel. And it's still there. It's kind of become increasingly cultish. I think over time, Israel would make state. It would be described as the most moral army in the world, and I think that was always absurd. But it wasn't such a ridiculous statement back then. I mean, there was genuine admiration by reasonable people of Israel back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and now it's simply fear, on the part of Israel's enemies, and then there's this kind of cultish devotion to it. People who believe in this apocalyptic cult. And then there's just frankly this very ugly celebration of violence. I think that that's something that comes out of the neocons. Again, I think I told you, it was part of what one of the reasons that the neocons admired Israel is that, they didn't show restraint, and they wanted the U.S. to go down the same path, and we're seeing that starting to happen. It's just sort of like, a celebration of violence. All those things are coming together. But, it has a powerful hold on certain people, a lot of people in this country, and of certainly people within Israel. But it looks very, very ugly to the rest of the world.
Sure. Jeffrey Sachs makes it sound like if the United States just didn't veto the two-state solution, veto the recognition of the Palestinians as an own state in the UN, then if we just did that, then everything should be all right. Do you believe that? Is there any
Yeah,
Is
I
that
wish I
possible?
could.
Is it
Right.
two-state solution?
I love Jeffrey Sachs. He's a wonderful man, but I just don't see that as a real option at this point. It's just that,
What would happen if the U.S. did? Like, let's just say that, okay, we didn't veto it, and then we say, okay, we recognize
yeah,
Palestine as a state. What does that mean? What happens?
right. Well, there would be tremendous anger within Israel, and they just might respond by lashing out further and creating facts on the ground, which they've already have, of which there are many already, and
Creating
there would
what?
facts on the ground. It's just in other words,
Oh,
say the fact is that you've seen the maps of Israel, and the portion that's actually, of the West Bank that's actually under Palestinian control has been shrinking steadily since 1967, and now it's much less than half. They're just little green dots,
mm,
where there used to be um, a solid green patch that's been broken up into very small dots. And then we're seeing the same thing happen in Gaza right now. I mean, Gaza again, it always suffered, but it was a contiguous Palestinian territory, and that was one thing that Gaza had going for it. But the Israelis, part of what they're doing right now is that they're breaking it up. They're giving it the West Bank treatment, and um, they're creating facts on the ground. You mean the UN can do this? Um, Now, the U.S. would have to back it up. There have been UN resolutions, like there was a the Minsk Agreement was codified through a UN resolution, and we just ignored it. The signatories, Ukraine, France, Germany, just ignored it. Quite plainly sabotaged it. And so we could vote for it, and just if we don't back it up with real action, that doesn't mean anything. If we did back it up, that would mean like no more munitions and maybe, economic sanctions and that kind of thing. And Israel, being a very small, independent country, wouldn't be able to last very long. But I mean, it's just the extremism, the again this um, the people like Ben Gvir, these Kahanists that actually rule larger and larger more and more sectors of Israeli society. Again, they were once on the fringe, and now they control the police. Now settlers were few and far between back there in the early '70s, and now they control most of the West Bank. And these people are gonna, they're like the ultranationalists in Ukraine. They're just not gonna. It may not make any sense. It may not be in their own interests, but they are going to fight to the death, and they do have nuclear weapons. So I think it's a very, very scary situation. I just don't think that there was a time when what Jeffrey Sachs said was true. I think if back in the '70s and even through the '80s, maybe if we had really meant what we said, we've always said that we've been in favor of a two-state solution, but we didn't really mean it. That's the truth. But if we had put some real muscle behind it, um, then perhaps it could have been achieved back then. I just think that day is past now.
okay. So no two-state solution possible. So then that means even if we withdraw support in some way, the likelihood of Israel normalizing relations with its neighbors is pretty much non-existent, you would say, especially with all these settlers that are in the West Bank, right? That it's
Yeah,
not going to disappear.
yeah,
So then what we're looking at is what the only thing would be the destruction of the state of Israel, right? That's where this is all heading at some point.
yeah. It could. Yeah, I mean, it
Is
seems
there
like
any other solution? I mean,
well, there's a chance that people will come to their senses, and I just don't see it, though. I just don't see it.
so
I
if
would
that's what
like
we're
to believe
banking
it.
on,
Yeah,
massive reform, all 800,000
yeah,
settlers in the West Bank say, oops, sorry,
yeah.
shouldn't have done
Right.
this. We're going to pack up and we're going to move into Tel Aviv or
Right.
Haifa or
I
something.
can see it happening again, for the reasons that we gave within the U.S. over the course of years. That seems to be the trend. A lot of people are waking up, but I just don't see it happening in Israel and everything. Actually, the trend is all going the other way. If at some point we begin to see, that there is a large sector of Israeli society, and that has really woken up to the reality and does really renounce Zionism and is looking for truly to live as a normal nation in that part of the world. Those people existed in the past and they had some power. But now they're just, those people are so few for they just, for all practical purposes, don't exist in Israel.
It's so
And
crazy to me that Israel would always be so resistant to a two-state solution, because to me this is clearly the only way that Israel could survive. It has to, if you want to be here, you have to make friends with your neighbor. Not have to make friends, but you can't
yeah,
continually expand. You
right,
can't continually invade your neighbors' countries and take their homes and just like and
right,
expect that that'll be okay. Like it's just insane that they didn't want a two-state solution.
yeah,
Like you guys, all right, congrats, you won the 1967 war or
right,
whatever. You took huge swaths of land that didn't belong to you. You got a modern colonial experiment and you captured a territory. Okay, it was wrong, and we'll have to hash out some things I'm sure in the future. But you could exist as a state if they stood there and they stopped and they tried to establish good relations with all their neighbors and trade and be a good neighbor instead of just constantly building up walls and shooting people.
hmm well, yeah. Again, I think you do have to point the finger at the U.S. as being absolutely instrumental in all this, because it was that faction, that refusal to consider the two-state solution was really only made possible by the U.S. The Israelis began to understand that the U.S. is not serious about the two-state solution, that they, in fact, they support this expansion into these territories. The Zionism is very much alive, which means a continual expansion, and that um, um, so all those factions, which were already quite powerful within Israel, they had the backing of the U.S. and those smaller and weaker factions that opposed the expansions of the West Bank. They were weakened by the fact that the U.S. wasn't backing them up. And so I think over time, if the U.S. had been firm and been actually honest about, their commitment to the two-state solution, and they backed it up, Israel could have turned out to be a different place too, just like Ukraine could have turned out to be a different place. It was because I think of the support that was thrown to these, the more extreme members. The Zionists, the expansionists within Israel, and the ultranationalists in Ukraine, that these became, in large part, I don't think it's possible without that U.S. support over all those years. They wouldn't have become the dominant powers because they would have been staring at this reality. It's just that, hey, we're kind of a weak country, and the U.S. has conditioned their support on our support for a two-state solution. Hey, let's be realistic. Let's achieve it. They never had to make that choice, and in fact, it was the people who clearly always wanted to seize the West Bank. Those are the people that ended up in the ascendancy.
Scary stuff, Dad. And it seems like from what you're saying that the ability to course correct is really not there. It's very difficult at this stage
It's
for
very
Israel
difficult. We have
and the
it.
United States.
Again, history is full of surprises, and maybe I said that there are maybe leaders in the future who can perform miracles. I just don't see them now. I just don't see them now.
We need to get you in the Oval Office, Dad.
No, no,
Start
no,
calling
no.
the shots.